Hi everybody. This part of the lecture is going to continue on heart anatomy, and we're also going to look at some of the blood vessels associated with the heart and supplying the heart itself, known as coronary arteries or I should say coronary blood vessels. So for the first part of this lecture, we are going to be focusing on the heart valves. The idea or the goal of heart valves is to make sure that blood is only moving in one direction in your heart, which basically means from the atria to the ventricle and from the ventricles out of the two main arteries, which is your pulmonary trunk and aorta. To ensure that the blood is only moving in the direction that is described and not backflowing to the other regions they come from, there are a set of four valves that are present. There are two, I guess I should say, there's four valves present within your heart, located strategically to prevent to prevent the backflow taking place in your heart, ensuring unidirectional movement of blood flow through the heart. So the first set of valves that we're going to describe are located between the atria and the ventricles. So the name they receive for that is basically atrioventricular. So atria, ventricular as in ventricle. So atrioventricular is located between atria and ventricle, and it's located both on the right and left. The other set of valves we have are semilunar valves. These are shaped like half moons, so their shape is similar to this, and as a result they received their name semilunar, and their location would be between the ventricles and the blood vessels that are exiting, which again, in reality, it would be pulmonary trunk on the right-hand side, and if we're talking about the left-hand side, it would be aorta on the left-hand side. So let's take a look at the first category of valves we have, called the atrioventricular valves. So atrioventricular valves are located again between the atria and ventricle, and their goal is to ensure that these blood vessels, the blood that is in the ventricles will not backtrack into the atria as ventricles contract. So let's take a look at their names, and then I'll show you on a picture. So the valve that is located on the right-hand side of the heart, between the right atrium and right ventricle, valve located right here, is called tricuspid valve because it has three flaps, hence the word three cusps. Cusps means flap. So three cusp or three flaps. On the left-hand side, we have a valve, same thing, but on the left-hand side, in between the two, we have a valve that only has two of these flaps, so they get the name bicuspid, which also referred to as left AV valve or mitral valve. Now, if you recall, we identified this structure called chordae tendineae, which were just strings that holds and anchors valves of the heart. And these chordae tendineae were connected to muscles called papillary muscles. So let's take a look at the picture so I can identify some of these structures for you. So let me find my pen, 1 second. So in here we have the right atrium, we have the left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. So if you're identifying your structures, your AV valves, what you see here in white, right here and right here, will be identified as tricuspid valve on the right hand side and mitral or bicuspid valve on the left hand side. They're connected to these strings right here and right here, called the chordae tendineae, and they are attached to this finger-like extension we mentioned on the last PowerPoint called the papillary muscle. Here is a real nice picture of that process. or sorry, those are structures. These are the chordae tendineae, and these are the papillary muscle. And sitting on top right here would be your AV valves. So what is the job of these blood vessels? So let's take a look at this picture, which clarifies some of the concept for you. So we have blood flowing down from the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium, and similarly we have blood flowing into the left atrium using the 4 main pulmonary veins. Now blood is coming into the right atrium and moves down toward the ventricles, right? Now, when I contract the bottom half of the heart, which is the ventricles, I want the blood to go out of the pulmonary trunk, right? And the aorta you see right here, correct? That's my goal, out of the pulmonary trunk and aorta. But think about this. If blood is coming down here, if I squeeze this part, the blood can either go through the blood vessels or it can go back up to the atrium, which is right here and right here. So my goal is to prevent blood from backflowing up, and I want it to only go through the 2 blood vessels. So how do I do that? I block this. So I close these valves and I put them in the closed position. This valve and this valve also put in closed position. This way, let me go forward so I can erase all of the arrows. So by doing that, by putting the AV valves into the closed position and closed position, what I ensure is as the ventricle contracts, blood can only go up of the pulmonary trunk and out of the aorta and not up to the 2 atria. Here in this picture, you can also see the better picture. This is the superior cut of the heart. This is 3 flaps, so this is tricuspid valve. This is 2 flaps, so this is mitral or bicuspid valve. The next set of valves we have are called the semilunar valves. Now these valves are located between the blood vessels, which is aorta and the pulmonary trunk, and your ventricles. So again, between major arteries, which if you think about them would be on the right hand side pulmonary trunk, and on the left hand side would be aorta. So these valves are engaged, and it's not written, so please make a note on them. It is engaged when ventricles contract. Oh, sorry, not ventricle contract. When ventricle relax. Oof. When ventricle relax. So what is happening? So let me just show you the picture of the heart, and then we'll look at the terminology in just a minute. So you have blood that came through the right atrium and the left atrium, came down to the ventricles, and then your heart pumped out of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, right? Notice that the valves that are referred to as the AV valves right here and right here are both closed. And in this case, these valves you see right here, these semilunar valves right here, and one that is up there, you can't really see them, but they're right there. They would be basically open so blood can come out of the blood vessels. Now, notice how in this top picture, the ventricles are squeezed, so they're basically contracting. On the bottom picture, the ventricles are relaxing, right? So it means basically they're opening up, right? So you just push blood out into these 2 blood vessels. But as soon as the ventricle starts to relax, it's like you squeeze a balloon and then you let it go. What does blood want to do? Blood wants to come back down, back to the 2 ventricles, right? It wants to come back and backtrack to the ventricles. What is the goal of your semilunar valves? To basically close up here, right? And close up somewhere here to prevent the blood from coming back down to the ventricles when ventricles start to relax. Now, looking at the terminology of these blood vessels, If the blood vessels is associated with the right side of the heart, which means between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, we refer to it as the pulmonary semilunar valve. And if it's between the left ventricle and aorta, we refer to it as aortic semilunar valve. Both of them prevents the backflow of blood to the ventricles when ventricles are relaxed. So AV valves are engaged when ventricles are contracting, preventing blood backflow to the atria. Semilunar valves are engaged when ventricles are relaxed, and it prevents backflow of blood to your ventricles. Here's another picture, the real picture of the heart structure, to kind of help you identify some of the valves. You have the tricuspid, you have chordae tendineae, and you have papillary muscle. You have, this would be representing your left ventricle, so you're coming up, this would be your pulmonary trunk. So what you see here is the pulmonary semilunar valve. On the left hand side, what you have is up here would be your bicuspid valve. These are your chordae tendineae. This is your papillary muscle. Unfortunately, you don't see your aortic valve, but it would be somewhere underneath there, which basically prevents the backflow of blood between this ventricle, left ventricle, and aorta, which is this large blood vessel you see. Two conditions associated with the valves. One is called the incompetent valve, which basically implies that the valve doesn't close properly, so blood flows back to the heart, and that means that the heart needs to be pumping that blood over and over again. The other one is called valvular stenosis, which is when the valves are being very hard to move or open when they're needed. So this has to do with the actual structure of the valve that is very stiff. In such a case, your heart really needs to be squeezing hard to create a lot of pressure to open those valves as needed. And these valves can be replaced through surgery. And what you replace it with is either a mechanical valve, a valve that is coming from a cadaver, or valves that are coming from animals. Typically that means pigs, as a good valve replacement for humans. This chart represents the blood flow through the heart as well as the systemic and pulmonary circulation. This information on this slide is identical to the picture that I'm showing you. So I'm actually going to go over the picture. It's a good review, guys. If you're watching this, try to say it with me so you can get your practice. Remember, blue is always representing deoxygenated blood and red always representing oxygenated blood. So here we have blood coming through the superior and inferior vena cava, coming into the right atrium. It passes through your tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. It passes through the pulmonary semilunar valve out through the pulmonary trunk and branching to the pulmonary arteries. That blood ends up in your lungs, where deoxygenated blood is oxygenated. It is returned back to the heart using two right pulmonary veins and two left pulmonary veins into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it goes through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it passes through the aortic semilunar valve through the aorta. Aorta pumps blood through the systemic circulation, where oxygenated blood goes through the capillary network and it becomes deoxygenated blood. Deoxygenated blood is back to the right side of the heart using the inferior and superior vena cava. Now, the last concept we're going to discuss is the coronary circulation. Coronary circulation is the blood vessels essential for supplying the heart with oxygenated blood. One point that is really important for you guys to know is the following regarding the distribution of these arteries to the chambers of the heart. Left ventricle is going to receive majority of the blood coming from the coronary blood supply. And the reason for this is this. If you look at your two atria really is small. They don't really do any pumping action or contraction. So they don't really need a lot of energy, right? So these are very low energy, which means basically low O2 requirement. Right ventricle is supplying blood to your lungs. And if you think about the location, right ventricle is relatively close to your lungs because basically they're flanking your heart. So your ventricle, right ventricle, does not need to create a lot of force to pump to the lungs. So very low myocardium. On the other hand, what we have is left ventricle that is going to send the blood to the whole body, which means it has a high concentration of what? Myocardium, which basically means muscles of the heart. And the more muscles you have, what do you need? More energy. And the more energy you need what? High supply of O2. Oops, this is O2. So that is the reason why your left ventricle requires a significant amount of blood supply. So looking at this, if you guys recall, we discussed coming from the aorta, there are two small branches that are coming off of the aorta directly, the first branching, which are known as the left and right coronary arteries. And these blood vessels are going to supply the heart itself. There is redundancy in blood vessels to make sure that your heart is receiving enough oxygenated blood per its requirement. Interesting fact, if you look at your heart blood supply, there is about 1/20 of the total blood supply gets directed back to the heart itself to supply enough oxygenated blood to the tissue so your heart can act as a very effective pump. So it is a significant amount of energy and supply, considering your heart weighs less than a pound in total. Now, I mentioned the redundancy in the blood vessels, which is basically anastomosis. These are, again, provide redundancy in your blood supply. But if there are any type of blockage in the main blood vessels, these anastomosis will not be sufficient to supply the heart with blood, and that leads to something we refer to it as heart attack, which I'll mention in a few minutes. So let's take a look at your blood vessels of the heart. And the information here is, but I'm going to show you on the picture because I think it's a little bit easier to follow. So let me show you. I'm going to do it with the black color. So this is your aorta right here. So you have two main blood vessels coming off of it for the heart, this one and this one. So this is on the left side, so this is left coronary artery. And this one right here is right coronary artery. Now left, as it comes down, it branches to 1 and 2 branch. One is going down right in the middle, separating your two ventricles. It's in front of the heart, so I call it anterior interventricular artery. The other one goes behind, basically circles around the heart, so we refer to this as circumflex artery. Right coronary artery, which is what you see here, also twists and goes behind the heart. You see this going in the back of the heart to form one of the major branches that supplies the back of the heart, this one, called the posterior interventricular artery. They're kind of similar. This is in front, that's in the back. You also have these main branch right here called right marginal artery. And in addition, what you also have is these tiny branches of the coronary arteries that actually differ from one person to another. So there is no specific pattern that you need to know. They differ from one person to another. Here is another picture that highlights the same concept. Again, we don't see the coronary arteries that actually initiates. What you see is just a piece of the coronary artery here. Coming down would be your anterior interventricular. Going across would be circumflex. This is your right coronary artery right here. This is your marginal artery right here. These branches again differ from one person to another. And if you go to the back of the heart, what you will see is basically your right coronary artery coming around and forming this blood vessel right here, which is called the posterior interventricular artery. Now, as you supply this blood, you also need to collect deoxygenated blood. So for that, you use coronary veins. Coronary veins, with the exception of the anterior cardiac vein, all of them empties into the coronary sinus. Anterior cardiac veins empties directly into the right atrium. So let's take a look at these blood vessels. So here we have three main blood vessels, and I mentioned the fourth one. Great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, and a small cardiac vein. A small, great, and middle in the back all empty into this kind of a chunky blood vessel you see right here in the back called the coronary sinus. Small, middle, great, like a small, middle, great, right? Three sizes. And then these ones you see right here, these little tiny branches in front, these are called anterior cardiac veins, which directly empty itself into the right atrium. Last concept we're going to talk about is associated with the coronary arteries. One is angina pectoris. Angina is the chest pain you get basically when there is some sort of heart problem. More specifically, it is a result of a deficiency of blood supplies to the heart muscle or myocardium that prevents the heart from basically carrying its function, and that causes chest pain, which is referred to as angina. In such cases, cells are weakened because they don't have enough oxygen being delivered to them. A myocardial infarction is when you have your coronary arteries that supplies the heart or literally have long-term blockage, and therefore the cells of the heart will not receive oxygen and supply, and those cells will die. So basically part of the heart literally dies when a person has a heart attack. Now the thing is, if this the issue is that if this person recovers from the heart attack, so it wasn't a massive heart attack that actually caused death, if the heart attack is small enough that basically allows the person to survive, those cells that are dead are going to be repaired, but they're going to be repaired with non-contractile scar tissue. which means that the ability of the heart to pump as strongly would basically diminish. So if a person has a heart attack, even if they recover, their heart will never be as strong as it was before the heart attack. Okay, I'm going to stop here and we'll pick up the rest in your next PowerPoint.